6:40 in the morning. Your alarm goes off. You don't think about it, but in the next 90 seconds, you'll touch more life-saving technology than most humans who ever lived would touch in a lifetime. A phone that knows the weather before you've opened your eyes. A tap that gives you clean water on demand. A refrigerator quietly guaranteeing that the food inside it won't kill you today. A thermostat fighting the outside temperature without you lifting a finger. None of that is an accident. It's the end result of 10,000 years of humans deciding over and over again what actually mattered enough to fight for. So here's the question this film is going to answer, and it's not the question you think. It's not, how did ancient people survive? Survival is easy to explain. Cold kills you, hunger kills you, isolation kills you. The real question is stranger. Out of everything they could have spent their limited time, energy, and risk on, what did they choose? What did they decide was worth the labor of a lifetime? Stick around, because the answer is going to rewire how you look at your own life by the end of this. Because here's the twist almost nobody expects, and I mean nobody. It wasn't the hunt, it wasn't the weapon, it wasn't even the fire. The single most defended, most obsessed over resource in half of ancient North America was something you've probably never once worried about in your entire life. A room. An empty, boring-looking room. We'll get to that. First, you need to lose your house. Picture the same morning, but 1,300 years earlier, in a sandstone canyon in what is now southwest Colorado. No alarm, the cold does that for you. Your bedroom isn't a bedroom. It's a stone alcove roughly 6 feet by 8, barely enough space for you and 2 other people to lie down, tucked hundreds of feet up a cliff face that you reached last night using hand and toe holds carved directly into solid rock. There is no light switch, there is no water tap. There is, somewhere below you in the canyon, a reservoir that your grandparents built by hand, and that your children will still be repairing 60 years from now. And there is no refrigerator, which means right now, in the freezing pre-dawn dark, the single most important object in your world isn't a weapon. It isn't even the fire. It's a small, plastered, sealed-off room a few feet from where you slept, and if that room fails, you and everyone you love could be dead by spring. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual math these people lived inside every single day. Most documentaries about ancient people focus on the hunt the spear, the bow, the kill. It's dramatic. It's cinematic. And it's honestly the wrong obsession. But this video is based on real research about ancient peoples. The hunt only matters for a few hours. What determined whether a family lived or died was what happened in the other 364 days of the year, and the archaeological record makes that painfully clear the moment you stop looking at weapons and start looking at floor plans. At Mesa Verde, in the cliff dwellings built between 1150 and 1200 CE, researchers mapped out exactly how space was used inside these stone apartments. And the living quarters, the actual rooms where people slept, ate, and raised children, were tiny. 6 by 8 feet. Just enough for 2 or 3 bodies. But right next to those cramped human spaces sat something far bigger, far better built, and far more carefully sealed. Plastered storage cysts, elevated off the ground, lined against dampness, capped against rodents, built to protect one thing: dried maize, beans, and squash. Think about that. These people had the skill to build entire apartment complexes into a cliff wall, and when it came time to decide where the best engineering went, they didn't put it into their own comfort. They put it into a room full of dried corn. That's not primitive thinking. That's a society that had already done the math on what actually kills you, and it isn't the cold on your skin, it's the empty room in February. The cold, though, wasn't ignored. It was managed like a piece of critical infrastructure, the same way we treat a power grid. Walk into one of these alcoves today and you can still see it. The ceilings and walls are stained black with soot, layer over layer, evidence that fires burned inside these rooms continuously for months at a time, all winter long. That fire wasn't ambiance. It was the only thing standing between a family and hypothermia in a season that could easily kill the very old and the very young. And 2,000 miles north in the high Arctic, an entirely different culture solved the exact same problem with an entirely different tool, one so central to survival that entire households organized their lives around keeping it alive. The Thule people, who crossed into the Canadian Arctic around 1000 CE, built their homes underground semi-subterranean sod houses, framed with the ribs and jawbones of bowhead whales, with long, sloping entrance tunnels engineered specifically to trap cold air before it reached the living space. Clever. But the real survival technology sat inside, glowing in the dark. A crescent-shaped soapstone lamp called a quollic, burning rendered seal or whale blubber through a wick of dried Arctic cotton grass. That one lamp did everything. It melted snow into drinking water. It dried out soaked hides so nobody went to sleep in wet clothing during a polar night that could last weeks. It cooked food. It lit the darkness. And tending it wasn't a chore you could phone in if the wick was packed wrong. The flame would smoke, gutter, or die, and an entire family's warmth, water, and light died with it. Somebody in that house, usually a woman, had to master that flame the way a pilot masters an aircraft. One skill entirely invisible to us today, and it was the actual thin line between a family surviving the winter and not Dort. Two cultures, thousands of miles apart, arrived at the same unspoken conclusion. Comfort is not what you protect first. Infrastructure is. And once that infrastructure was secured, the next question became unavoidable because neither the storage room nor the quollic built or fed or defended itself. That took people, which meant the next thing ancient humans had to get right wasn't a room or a lamp. It was each other. In the pre-contact Americas, isolation wasn't lonely. It was lethal. The physical labor required to build irrigation systems, clear fields, or organize a hunt large enough to feed a winter was simply beyond what one family could produce. So status in these societies stopped being about what you kept and became almost entirely about what you gave away. Nowhere is this clearer than with the Hopewell tradition, which flourished across the eastern woodlands and Midwest between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE. Here's the part that should stop you cold. These were not people living in one giant city. Most Hopewell communities were small, scattered hamlets of just 1 to 3 households spread out along river valleys. And yet these scattered families somehow coordinated across generations to build massive geometric earthworks and burial mounds at sites like Newark and Mound City, Ohio, engineering feats that required cooperation between villages that never lived under a single ruler. There was no king ordering this, no standing army enforcing it, no evidence of slave labor. So how do you get dozens of independent communities to spend generations building something together with nobody in charge? The answer is almost unsettling in how human it is. Charismatic individuals, archaeologists call them big men, built authority not through force but through favors. They organized feasts, they redistributed rare exotic materials, they negotiated peace between clans. Their power existed entirely inside a web of obligation they had built by giving things away, not by taking them. The earthwork centers themselves functioned as neutral, sacred meeting grounds where dispersed families gathered to bury their dead, trade goods, and rebuild the social trust that would carry them through the next bad season. And this instinct, the pull toward monumental cooperative construction, goes back even further than most people realize. At Watson Brake, Louisiana, hunter-gatherers built a circular complex of 11 earthen mounds around 3,500 BCE. That's roughly 2,000 years before agriculture even existed in the region. These were not farmers with surplus time on their hands. These were mobile hunter-gatherer bands who chose deliberately to invest enormous collective labor into a shared sacred gathering place because the alternative, scattering into isolated, disconnected bands, was simply more dangerous than the labor of building something together. Community wasn't a nice-to-have. It was load-bearing infrastructure, just like the storage room and the quollic. And once you understand that people were willing to build monuments just to stay connected to each other, it starts to make sense why the next thing they obsessed over was getting food, because feeding dozens or hundreds of people required exactly that kind of coordination, and frankly, some genuinely brilliant engineering. Here's a fact that sounds almost made up. Across California, one of the most important food sources for hundreds of indigenous groups was, in its raw form, toxic. The acorn, especially from the black oak, is loaded with bitter, poisonous tannic acid. You cannot just eat it. And yet acorns became a dietary staple, stable, high in fat and protein, because someone figured out how to defeat that poison using nothing but water, time, and stone. Women harvested the acorns in autumn and stored them in elevated, woven granaries called chukkas. lined with insect-repelling bay leaves. When it was time to eat, the nuts were shelled and ground into flour on stone slabs, then leached spread in a shallow sand basin, while water was poured over the meal again and again, for hours until the poison was gone. Then, because these cultures had no metal pots, they cooked the leached flour into a nutritious mush inside tightly woven, waterproof baskets by dropping red-hot stones straight into the basket and stirring constantly with wooden paddles so the burning rocks wouldn't scorch through the fibers and dump the entire meal onto the ground. That is not a simple process. That is food chemistry, executed by hand with zero margin for error, generation after generation. And on the Great Plains, the engineering wasn't chemical, it was psychological. At Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump in Alberta, indigenous hunters drove bison herds off a cliff for at least 6,000 years, using a method that exploited something almost cruel about how bison brains work. Hunters built funnel-shaped drive lanes out of thousands of small rock piles, stretching for kilometers, guiding the herd toward a cliff edge that, because of the rolling shape of the land, the animals could not actually see until they were just meters away. By the time the lead animals realized the ground was about to disappear, the sheer physical momentum of the panicked herd behind them made stopping impossible. This wasn't a lucky ambush. It was a multi-week operation requiring an intimate understanding of animal behavior, wind direction, and land shape, executed by people who had never seen the terrain from above the way we can with a map today. Below the cliff, the processing was just as calculated. Bones were broken down for grease, meat dried for winter, nothing wasted, because a failed hunt in autumn could mean starvation by February. Getting the food was hard, but none of this, the chukkas, the drive lanes, the leaching basins, could exist without one more invisible resource, one that never shows up in the dirt for archaeologists to dig up. The knowledge of exactly how to do it passed perfectly from one generation to the next without a single word ever being written down. In a world with no books, the most valuable resource a community could possess was a person old enough to remember what worked. Elders weren't just respected because of age. They were functionally irreplaceable living archives holding the location of water in a drought, the recipe for a medicinal plant, the genealogy that determined who could marry whom. At Mesa Verde, this mattered in an incredibly concrete way. Reservoirs like Moorfield and Box Elder took generations to build and constant upkeep to maintain understanding silt buildup, water flow, and dam repair, all without a single blueprint or written equation. That knowledge moved the only way it could, hands-on from an elder physically showing a teenager how to clear a silt basin year after year until the skill was locked into muscle memory rather than paper. And it wasn't just practical skills. Oral stories were built like survival manuals disguised as entertainment myths about culture heroes that quietly encoded warnings about reading the stars, processing poisonous plants safely, or surviving a drought that might only happen once a lifetime. Repeating these stories precisely, ritually, generation after generation was how a society backed up its most critical information with no hard drive at all. But knowing how to survive the physical world was only half the picture. Because to these communities, the world wasn't just physical. Every river, every stone, every animal was believed to be watching back. This is where the ancient worldview departs completely from how most of us think today. Nature wasn't a backdrop. It was a population of rivers, animals, plants, and stones that had intent and had to be negotiated with, not just used. Look at the Hopewell mortuary tradition. Inside their burial mounds, archaeologists have found stone platform pipes carved with strikingly lifelike animals, birds, bears, beavers, felines, and here's the detail that changes everything. The animals were carved to face the smoker. When someone lit that pipe and inhaled sacred tobacco smoke, believed to carry prayers into the spirit world, they were looking directly into the eyes of that carved animal. It wasn't decoration. It was a face-to-face meeting with a guardian spirit, built directly into the object. Even raw materials carried this weight. Copper, hauled 800 miles from the shores of Lake Superior, wasn't treated like a commodity, it was treated like a living thing. Oral traditions linked native copper to powerful water spirits, horned and tailed in copper themselves. And travelers were expected to make offerings before they dared mine it. When copper objects, breastplates, headdresses, effigies were eventually buried with the dead, they were often deliberately broken or bent first, ceremonially killed so their spiritual power could return to the earth rather than stay trapped in an object. This single detail, breaking something valuable on purpose before burying it, tells you everything about how differently these societies thought about ownership. And that same idea, that value isn't something you hoard, runs straight into the next thing that defined an entire society's economy. We tend to assume wealth means having more than your neighbor. In much of ancient North America, that idea would have sounded almost insane. Hoarding wasn't a flex, it was closer to a social illness. Status came from giving things away in ways that built obligation, trust, and alliance. And yet, rare materials absolutely mattered. They just moved differently than we'd expect. The Hopewell interaction sphere pulled in copper from the Great Lakes, silver from Ontario, mica from the southern Appalachians, shark teeth and marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian from Yellowstone over 1,500 miles away, all carried along river systems and worked by specialized artisans into sacred objects, then given away or buried, not kept. At Poverty Point in Louisiana, hunter-gatherers with no agriculture at all still mobilized the labor to build a 72-foot earthen mound, and archaeologists have pulled tons of imported stone out of that site, proof that trading for rare, meaningful materials and using them to build alliances mattered enough to organize an entire society around, long before anyone there ever planted a single crop. Wealth, in other words, wasn't a pile. It was a network. And keeping that network running required something else most people never associate with primitive societies: precision timing. At Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, archaeologists uncovered massive circles of towering cedar posts nicknamed Woodhenge, rebuilt, and expanded at least 5 times. Standing at the center post and watching the horizon, specific posts aligned exactly with the sunrise on the solstices and equinoxes. This wasn't decoration. The summer solstice marked the critical point in the maize growing cycle. The winter solstice signaled the moment to gather the community for ceremonial renewal. Getting this timing wrong wasn't a scheduling inconvenience. It could mean planting or harvesting at the wrong moment in a system with 0-calorie margin for error. Far to the southwest, Chaco Canyon operated the same way, with its great houses aligned to solar and lunar cycles and roads stretching for miles, pulling thousands of people toward the canyon for precisely timed ceremonial gatherings. To these societies, staying in sync with the sky wasn't superstition. It was calendar infrastructure as critical as the storage room back at Mesa Verde. And this brings us to the one certainty every single one of these people eventually faced, no matter how well they built, stored, or timed everything: death. How a society buries its dead tells you what it believes matters, because burial is the one moment a community will spend real resources on something with 0 practical return. And in the Hopewell world, that spending was enormous. Select individuals were placed in log-lined tombs inside ceremonial structures, surrounded by staggering craftsmanship: a copper axe weighing 38 pounds, headdresses of wooden antlers sheathed in hammered copper. Once the rituals were complete, the wooden structure was deliberately burned to the ground and buried under a mound of earth. This wasn't about showing off wealth for the deceased's ego. These objects were spiritual tools, symbols of office, and burying them was a form of collective sacrifice, deliberately returning valuable, hard-won materials to the earth to keep the cosmos in balance and honor the dead as active, ongoing members of the community, not people who had simply ceased to exist. Death didn't end a person's role. It transformed it. And that same instinct that the living owes something back to the world around them shows up again in one of the biggest myths this entire film needs to correct. There's a popular idea that pre-contact North Americans lived lightly on an untouched, pristine wilderness. The archaeology says almost the opposite. These were active, deliberate landscape engineers. In the Sierra Nevada, the Miwok, Paiute, and Monach, peoples regularly set controlled ground fires through the oak woodlands every autumn. Left alone, fast-growing pines would eventually choke out the oaks and collapse the acorn harvest that entire communities depended on. So they burned it back on purpose at low intensity, clearing brush, killing off young conifers, destroying the pest larvae that would otherwise ruin next year's crop, and even encouraging the growth of the exact plants used for basket weaving, and the grasses that attracted deer. This is landscape as a garden, not wilderness. These weren't people passively adapting to whatever nature handed them. They were shaping the environment, generation after generation, to keep delivering exactly what they needed. And it's a perfect final example of the pattern running through this entire story. Nothing here was left to chance. Not the storage room, not the Qualic, not the mounds, the acorns, the calendar, or the fire in the forest. Every single one of these was a deliberate choice about what deserved the effort of a human life. So picture it all together. One last time, a single day in a village like Spruce Tree House at Mesa Verde, home to somewhere between 60 and 90 people. Dawn breaks cold. Cooking fires are lit in the courtyards. Men climb the canyon walls using those hand and toe holds to reach the mesa top fields, where their entire day is spent defending the maize clearing brush, repairing check dams, watching the reservoirs. Down in the alcove, women kneel for hours over stone grinding slabs, turning dried maize into flour, a task so repetitive it left permanent wear marks on their bones. Turkeys wander the courtyard. Pottery gets shaped and painted with careful, unhurried geometric designs, not because anyone required beauty, but because beauty mattered too. At sunset, everyone comes back together. Stories get told. Some men descend into the kiva for ritual and to talk through the politics of the village. Children fall asleep, wrapped in turkey feather blankets, next to rooms packed with enough dried corn to survive a drought that might last years. Every single piece of that day, the storage room, the reservoir, the pottery, the stories, was there for a reason. Nothing was wasted effort. Nothing was decoration for its own sake. Now go back to that alarm clock, the phone, the fridge, the thermostat. None of that is what makes a life meaningful. And honestly, the people in this film never had the luxury of confusing comfort with purpose. They didn't get to obsess over convenience because their attention was locked, every single day, onto the things that actually determined whether the people they loved lived or died: the integrity of a storage room, the flame in a stone lamp, the trust between families, the knowledge passed hand to hand because there was no other way to save it. We've automated almost all of that away. Our storage rooms are refrigerators that never need to be checked by hand. Our Quolic is a thermostat on the wall. Our elders, the living libraries who once held everything worth knowing, have been quietly replaced by a search bar. And that's not necessarily a tragedy, but it does raise the question this whole film was actually asking from the very first 10 seconds. If you took all of that automation away tomorrow and you had to decide with your own two hands what actually deserved your effort, your family, your community, your knowledge, your integrity, would you even know where to start? They did. And maybe that's the real inheritance they left behind, not the mounds, not the pottery, not the tools in a museum case. The proof that a good life was never about what you accumulate. It was always about what you protect. And if there's one thing this story makes clear, it's that none of what you just watched survived by accident. It survived because people made a choice, over and over, to pass it on to the next family, the next generation, the next storyteller sitting by the fire. That's really all a channel like this one is trying to do in a much smaller way. Dig up the stuff that actually mattered and make sure it doesn't get lost. If this changed how you think about what matters even means, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this history still buried, and I'd rather you hear it than let it stay forgotten. Drop a comment and tell me which detail hit you hardest, whether it was the Quolic, the copper spirits, or the size of that storage room compared to the bedroom. And if you know someone who'd get something out of this, send it their way, because if this whole documentary proved anything, it's that the good stuff was never meant to be kept to yourself.